thank you, Cheryl, for a wonderful presentation of the micronutrient policy side of the work that we have been doing. Now, let me introduce you the next speaker, Dr. Stephen Haggblade, Professor of International Development at the Michigan State University. Steve was also Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI before moving to Michigan State. Steve.
Actually, Suresh, I'm a recidivist. I've been at IFPRI twice in my career, so stand back. I may come back for a third helping here. My mandate here is to try to generalize from all these 6 different case studies. And I'm going to try to do it in 2 ways. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look backwards. I'm going to say, what did we learn from these 6 case studies? Okay, we tested these hypotheses in all the cases. And then I'm going to look forward and say, okay, in the future, given what we learned here, how can that help us identify opportunities for engaging in policy dialogue more effectively? Now, the empirical evidence that we have comes from the 6 case studies that Danielle and Cheryl have just summarized for you. In total, this surprised me a bit, 50 different times these policies got onto the agenda. So we have a sample size of 50 episodes of policy change where somebody got this pet issue onto the agenda, and then we traced it through to see what happened. How did they do it? Did they get passed? As you see, most of the time, once it got on the agenda, it got implemented. And I think this is quite important. If you're in a policy system, you've got a policy now, and there's a reason for that policy. If your policy is an export ban, well, why do we have this export ban? Well, it's because somebody very powerful is benefiting from that. So there's strong vested interests in keeping this existing policy. Now, to get something on the agenda means you're standing up and saying, wait a minute, this is not a very good policy. You need to do something different. What this tells us is that this is the hardest step in the whole process, is getting it on the agenda, breaking through all the vested interests to say, hey, we need to reconsider this. Once it gets on the agenda, in these cases at least, the reforms tended to go through. The other important feature that I want to highlight in this sample is, look at who's implementing. We're talking about public policy here, nutrition policy, and who's doing the implementation? Half the time it's the private sector. Same is true in these fertilizer subsidies. So this really got me thinking. When we think of policy processes, typically we think of government decision makers and so on, but really active, engaged parties in the system, those with big vested interests are in fact the private sector. A lot of them are Dave Shirley's little processors whom the government comes over and puts the screws to and says, you have to add iodine, or you have to add vitamin A, or you have to add this multimix. And it's this convenient for the government because Dave Shirley's processors, they buy all the fortificant, they go through all the work, they do all the physical distribution, and who pays? The consumer pays in the form of higher prices. So these private sector implementation mechanisms are attractive from a policymaker's perspective because they place very limited burden on government budgets and institutional resources. The kaleidoscope wheel, I know you can't read this, and Danielle and Cheryl have talked about it. What I want to just show you is the bullseye. The bullseye is policy change, and the 16 hypotheses that we're going to test are those enumerated there inside the bullseye. And so I'm going to go through quickly and summarize. What this tells you is the percentage of time in these 50 episodes that this variable was significant. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm just going to flag some common themes and some differences. 2 common themes. I said the agenda setting really matters, the hardest step. 2 things really helped. One is having a recognized problem. We all know soil fertility is a problem. These undernutrition figures were really shocking, 70, 80% iodine deficient and so on. So these were well-recognized problems. But that's not enough. This hypothesis 3 really matters a lot. You can have a big problem, but you also need an advocate. You need a very good advocate. And in these cases, we had them. There was a difference. In the case of the input subsidies, the advocates were almost always domestic politicians, often up for re-election. The advocates in the micronutrient policies were very different. They were either very charismatic public health officials. The best example we came across was from Malawi, where Mary Chawa, a very charismatic young nutritionist, turned out she went to the same church as Bingo, president of Malawi. Well, Mary Chawa caught Bingo after the sermon, and she made great inroads into micronutrient policy in Malawi. So having the right advocate really matters a lot. The other source of advocacy in the micronutrient space has been the donors. And at the international level, Cheryl mentioned the different venues. UNICEF really played a big role in these policies. We haven't mapped them chronologically, but as Cheryl said, there was this, well, I'm going to protest. Okay, noted, thank you. This 1990 UNICEF UN General Assembly meeting was really very pivotal moment. The heads of state of 130 countries committed to combating child malnutrition, and probably half of the micronutrient policies took place in the 90s. There was a clear response to that. Let me speed up here. On the design stage, I'll just point out a difference here. These ideologies and beliefs mattered a lot in input subsidies, not so much in micronutrients. And the reason is that it's this belief in the market. If you believe that traders are thieves, then you definitely want to distribute fertilizers through the government. If you believe markets work perfectly, like Jeff Hill knows they do, then you want a smart market-oriented system. So that's why the ideology mattered in the subsidies. At the adoption stage, this shouldn't be any great surprise. If you have powerful proponents, you get through, and if the deciders, the government decision makers are on your side, it gets through as well. Big difference. I talked earlier about how important the private sector was in implementing public policy. Well, what this shows here is if you're depending on them to implement policy, you also are subject to their whims. And so if Dave Shirley goes on strike, you're out of luck. And in roughly half the cases, that's what happened. About a fourth of the micronutrient cases didn't get implemented, and that half the time it was because of the private sector. It was even a bigger issue with the input subsidies. How do policies get changed? Danielle really highlighted this. You get new information or conditions change, you run out of budget money, and you have to rethink things. Now, for looking forward, what does this mean? Here are beta testers, and so I want you to tell us afterwards if this sounds sensible to you. We've come up with a checklist of 4 items to say, looking forward, I want to decide whether I'm going to engage in this policy debate. And we're proposing a 4-item checklist. Do you have credible evidence? Do you have a powerful advocate? Is there financing? And is this an opportune moment? And I'll just show you here. Jeff Hill has been probably the most passionate advocate of empirical evidence-based decision-making, and I didn't really appreciate how perceptive Jeff is until we tallied these numbers up. But look at where evidence comes into the system. To get it on the agenda, it has to be a recognized problem. The focusing events all relied on this empirical evidence. The powerful advocates beat people over the head with these policy briefs and the Lancet special issues at the design stage and at the evaluation stage. So evidence matters, but evidence alone is not enough. And everybody in this room, I'm willing to bet, has done a beautiful study, maybe your best study ever, and it's sitting on the shelf and nobody ever paid any attention to it. I know it's happened to me. You can have good evidence and no impact. So that's why there's more than one item on the checklist. You need evidence, but you need an advocate. You need somebody who can apply that evidence effectively to the right decision-making forum. You need budget resources to run it. Often the reform comes from a change in those resources. And then the fourth item you ask is this an opportune moment? And a lot of the shifts, particularly in the input subsidies, came from a change in a minister, a change in a president. So you can time your actions. But if you're asking, should I engage in this space, ask yourself 4 questions. Do I have credible evidence? Do I have a powerful advocate? Is there support for this? And is this the right time? Thank you.